So as a technology guy, I should know how to use Adobe Acrobat. Uh, but thank you for having me here today. I am gonna focus on the technology aspects of this as the director of HSARPA. I've got a few topics that I want to hit on. One, just give you an idea for those who don't know what the mission is of the Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, in terms of the scope of the problems that we face and the role specifically of the Science and Technology Directorate and my group in there, which is HSARPA, or the Homeland Security Advanced Research Projects Agency, and how we've had to shift that role a little bit in terms of what we did in the past. And then what I want to tell to you or ask of you is how do we do these technology countermeasures when we have an adaptive adversary and limited resource environment, and some of the ideas that we have on doing that, and maybe get some of your thoughts as well. So Homeland Security, DHS, any government official from the U.S. has to start with our mission space. But really the number one mission that we have is preventing terrorism and enhancing security. But that space goes well beyond in DHS in terms of the broad scope, which includes the securing and managing our borders, dealing with immigration affairs, looking at and securing cyberspace. And one of the challenges that we have in DHS is that we are the organization responsible within the United States for defending the commercial cyberspace. A lot of people consider DoD, and we've got a cyber command in our Department of Defense, and their budget is an order of magnitude larger than ours. But in terms of the .com and .gov domains, it is actually within DHS's purview to develop tools, techniques, and procedures to defend against that. And then we also have to ensure against resilience of disasters. So necking down into the Science and Technology Division within the department, our job really is to identify and develop and deploy technologies that can meet those challenges we've got today. How do we innovate? How do we adapt? How do we improve upon technologies to really protect America and save money at the same time? So our number one goal within S&T is to transition to use. In the past, a lot of times you look at HSARPA, the Homeland Security Advanced Research Projects Agency. When you want to look at an analog, a lot of people looked at DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. But we are nothing like DARPA. We don't have the budget, and we don't necessarily have the time horizons that they have. We continually are asked, what has HSARPA, what has HSARPA done, and what technologies that developed? And we've canonized this into a goal in terms of transitioning technologies to use. How do we develop and how do we deploy technologies within the next 24 to 36 months and get them out into the field so that we can help our operators within Customs and Border Protection, with Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, with the Federal Emergency Management Administration? All of those entities are part of the DHS purview, as well as providing support to our first responders. DHS S&T is actually the technology developer for all of our state and local responders, from New York City to Muscatine, Iowa, from fire departments to police departments. So how do we develop these technologies? How do we develop knowledge products? How do we support the broad range of entities that we need to support? One of the ways we're doing that within DHS is trying to develop closer relationships with our component partners. So we are developing stronger relationships with Customs and Border Protection. We are looking at how can we support activities on the border. How can we leverage technologies to improve not only our security, but our immigration and customs enforcement. We also recognize that we don't have the budget to build and deploy new technologies all of our own, and so we're implementing what we call technology foraging. How can we go out there and identify technologies that have already been developed by others and repurpose them for our use? How can we be innovative in the capabilities that we have? An example of this is NOAA, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration within the U.S., has radars, high-frequency radars all along the coast to do coastal monitoring, for look at wave conditions. Well, it turns out with changing some algorithms, you can actually repurpose those radars, which are already deployed and funded by NOAA, to detect small vessels under 10 meters. And so looking at leveraging that technology investment that's already out there, by integrating new technologies into it, we can actually create a whole new capability, so then we get situational awareness along our coastline, where we wouldn't have the budget to deploy a complete system as it stands. We're also looking at our internal processes in terms of how are we ensuring that we're investing our dollars in the right way, and how can we make sure that we support the user. So I talked about the evolution of HSARPA. In the past, you look at DARPA. They did invent the internet, the M16, stealth technology, other things. They have blue sky, far-reaching, basic research. If one of every 10 projects succeeds, that's considered successful. It turns out that I don't have that luxury, that I'm much more of a technology integration or technology development integration. My focus is less on basic research, but more on understanding the operational context of my components. And what I mean by that is I'm looking for ways that all of the missions, defining how all the missions that the department does. Customs and Border Protection already does their mission, and they do it reasonably well, but may not as well as they'd like, along with ICE and FEMA and the Secret Service. And so we're going along a process called operational context, and we're looking for priorities from these components. And one of those priorities that, for example, the Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection said was expediting the entry of foreign nationals into U.S. airports, something probably all of you have experienced. So when we look at that and we look at that challenge, we want to map out how is that done. For those that come from visa countries, we start with that process. When someone applies for the visa in the United States, to provide biographic and biometric information through the State Department. They buy their airline ticket. They go through TSA's databases to check to see whether they're on a no-fly list. They go through a security process to get onto the airplane. They fly on the airplane. They land. They go through, again, customs checkpoint, where they wait in line, and then they enter into the United States. And we can map out each process that they go through and call that the operational context. And then we can look at where can technologies help make that process more efficient. How can I find a pivot point within there, a leverage point where technology can make a huge difference, whether it's an operational or efficiency impact, making them do things faster, better, cheaper, or whether it's a capability impact, that they can do something they didn't before. So you can look at, for example, the 5-finger slap when you gather your biometric fingerprints when you come in. What if I were to have a technology that would allow you just to wave your hand over that and decrease the amount of time that it took for that person to give their fingerprints, so that potentially I could have fewer lanes but have the same amount of throughput because it takes less time to process those people. And that would be an efficiency impact. From a capability impact, what if I could, as I do that, wave your hand over a fingerprint scanning machine, I could also detect trace amounts of explosives. So not only could I see if someone had handled explosives before they came into the country, but I could gather their fingerprint at the same time. And so those capability and efficiency impacts are key to our technology programs. And the other key that I want you to think about that I'll discuss towards the end of the presentation is, how do I develop and implement technologies with this constrained cost environment? How do I look at the existing infrastructure and upgrade technologies versus providing all new capabilities? And the idea in S&T really is that we want to transition products to use. That DHS has the challenge, such as many first responders have, how do you get those things integrated into operational use when there's not necessarily an element that does that? The military is a perfect example within the Department of Defense in the U.S. If they're not fighting a war, they're training. So they're deployed for a year and they come back and train and integrate new technologies. Our Customs and Border Protection officers don't have that luxury. They don't get that timeline to train. They're operational 99.9% of the time. And if they have 2 weeks off to train and improve their skills, they're lucky. So how do I integrate? In that environment, how do I integrate advanced technologies? What can S&T do to help them gather those capabilities? And so the mission for HSARPA really is protect America, which seems obvious, but save money as well. I don't have the luxury of deploying dedicated systems that provide new capabilities. You know, in that fingerprint example I gave you, the key to that example was the fact that those fingerprints are already taken. How can I leverage that installed and employed infrastructure and improve it, because the likelihood of that being transitioned is much higher than if I gave a new piece of gear to one of our first responders and asked them to use it, that it did a sole thing. And if you talk to any guy who's out in the field, whether it be an infantryman, whether it be a cop on the beat, or whether it be a fire department guy, the last thing that they want is another piece of gear from the technology guys that they have to carry. It means more power, it means more operations and maintenance, it means more work for them to deploy it. So how can we leverage those existing infrastructures to improve their capabilities? The other challenge that we have within DHS is that we are not just supporting our components, those that I talked about, the FEMA, the Secret Service, the ICE, but also those first responders. And the structure or the space and scale that we deal with in the states is huge in terms of the tens of thousands of different localities and municipalities between the fire department and the police department. So what can I do to support them? I can't give them each a piece of technology. I can't necessarily work with each one of them individually. And so our goal really is to be a technology and information clearinghouse for first responders. We want to take the best of the lessons learned from the large areas, like NYPD has developed a new app that works on a smartphone that allows them to communicate with their command board. Well, Chicago and Houston and LA probably have a similar requirement to do something like that. We want to become that app star. We want to become that information and technology clearinghouse so that those best practices get transferred and leveraged across the entire United States. And this is a perfect role for us. You know, is it really New York's job to try and share their technologies with others? It's not. They don't have that time. They don't have that mission. They don't have that money. But it's our job. And so this is something we're actively going out and trying to do, and trying to leverage that information, leverage those capabilities that are being developed by the boots on the ground that know the mission best, and create a clearinghouse for other folks that want to access them. We'd like to actually establish an Amazon.com type store where you have the best practices for responding to a white powder, or applications that allow you to communicate with your dispatch center and actually have users rate them, and then have user comments in there, and so that people can search for those and look at, is this technology work in my field? And if someone clicks on that white powder response, a box comes up that says users that viewed this might also like, this anthrax detector, this handheld assay device. People laugh at things like that, but what we find is that our users are deluged with a myriad of technologies and snake oil salesmen, and they have no idea whether it works. So one of the challenges we've got is be that forager, that technology forager, so we can harvest those best ideas out there and leverage that capability. There are great practices being done across the world, and how can we gather those up and efficiently share that information? And that, frankly, is one of the biggest challenges that I have. I don't want to be the developer of all the new technologies, but if I could be the guy that allows those best technologies to get in the hands of the users that need them, I'll consider my organization wildly successful. So we're going to spend a lot of time and effort on trying establishing that information and technology clearinghouse. This just gives you a brief idea of the scope and scale of what we deal with. HSARPA, our budget is around $450 million US. We deal with borders and maritime, chem biodefense. We have a fairly big exercise going on in the States right now where we're releasing a bacteria within the Boston subway and tracking where that bacteria goes and how well our sensors can detect it. Our cybersecurity division is small compared with the Defense Department's. Our budget there is around $60 million, but we're looking at different ways that we can improve the infrastructure of the internet in terms of domain name security, in terms of routing capabilities, in terms of eliminating that fraud. I agree with the Commissioner that fraud is a key piece of funding for terrorist activities as well as a criminal element, and frankly, it's my job and my responsibility for those .com domains to develop the technologies against that. Explosives focus on mostly aviation security, but we also have the challenge of dealing in a mass transit environment. And when you look at that challenge, you look at the New York City subway system, what can handle hundreds of thousands, if not millions of passengers a day. What screening technologies can I implement there? And the challenge that I have is detection is not equal protection. Even if I detect someone carrying explosives within that subway environment, unless I have an officer there to interdict, how do I respond to that event? I have a human factors group that focuses on countering violent extremism, looking at some of those social science aspects, as well as biometrics capabilities, and then infrastructure protection and disaster management. How do I handle the hurricanes that regularly hit the United States? How do I make my processes more resilient? How do I look at improving my electrical grid resiliency? And the challenge we have with that broad mission scope is that our adversary, especially in certain areas, is becoming adaptive in thinking. You look at the scale or the types of attacks that we've seen on the aviation environment since the 70s. We see a lot of hostage taking early on. Then we see the Pan Am Lockerbie attack that occurred with the pressure switch. And then we go on towards the World Trade Center where we had people that, again, hijacked and attacked using the actual vehicle. You look at the shoe bomb, and then you look at standard suicide bombers. You look at liquid explosives and the rise of homemade explosives. And then you look at taking it to the next level of embedded bombs, inside the person. And how do I identify that with technologies? And then printer cartridge bombs. When you embed that within your bomb within a complex screened environment, how do I detect that? And so this adversary adapts, especially with the explosives types. Even while they might use the standard kinetic attacks, guns and bombs and things like that, but how they embed that and how they try and get through our security, they're continually thinking. And you take it to the next level. What happens when we start looking at biological terrorism, WMD catastrophes, a dirty bomb? How do I defend against this? And the challenge that I have is not that I am concerned, I am concerned about my own components within DHS, but the challenge is how do I give the tools to the private sector who will be mostly affected by these types of attacks? The first line of defense in a WMD attack is not going to be a federal employee. It will be that state and local first responder. It will be that public health person. And how do I give them the tools and technologies to make them successful? And the question is, how do they afford it? We've cut 50,000 public health professionals in the U.S. alone. And those people are dealing with your standard health diseases that we don't even, they're not even concerned about anthrax. They can't even handle the standard things that they see, drug resistance, tuberculosis. So how do I give them tools and technologies to make them successful? How do I allow a fireman who's already overwhelmed to handle a dirty bomb? What can I do in an improvised nuclear device attack? And this is the challenge we've got. This is the challenge I give to you, is how do you, in a resource-constrained environment, how can technology help those people? And what do we have to look at when we do those kinds of things? And the perfect example here that I like to give, especially to my staff, is biodetection. Let's say I develop the perfect biodetector. Let's say, I even make it relatively inexpensive for something that can detect anthrax of $5,000 each. It's relatively inexpensive. And I want to deploy this in the subways. We're doing the release of bacteria within the Boston Metro. Obviously, that bacteria spreads. It could contaminate the whole system. We're going to decide or test whether that's true or not. But even if it contaminates a quarter of that system, you're still looking at $1 billion impact. And I've got this $5,000 sensor. Well, if Boston's anything like the metro system in Washington, D.C., they don't have enough money to maintain their cars, let alone deploy a new biodetection system, let alone deploy the infrastructure, the power, and the communications, and the monitoring capability, as well as the response for that system. So even if I develop this perfect biodetector, is there a market out there that exists that will buy it? These low probability, high consequence events, thankfully these WMD ones are low probability still, but they're extremely high consequence. How do you develop the market for that? What can I do, even if I develop these technologies to get this deployed? I talked about the mass transit environment. If I have a perfect trace detection event, how can I make that attractive to those commercial entities? Remember, these aren't government folks, but commercial entities deploy it so that I can be resilient in the response to that event. In the U.S., the challenge we have is the memory of these large-scale attacks are receding. We have a difficult economic environment. And this really is where HSARPA's mission of protecting America and saving money is key. I need to be able to leverage those installed infrastructures and improve them, not try and develop new capabilities. I need to look at the operational way that those people do their job and try and make them really do more with less. It's an old adage, but I think it's the only way that I'm going to be able to develop and deploy counterterrorism technologies. So what can we do? How can we use this? How can we use this understanding to ensure more use of these technologies? What we're focusing on within HSARPA is dual use or added use technologies. Even at the Pentagon, which has probably the most advanced chem bioprotection system in the world, I was not able to sell the use of CCT, small cameras, for a bio or chem system only. I was able to use that because I was able to leverage that capability to have a physical security impact. The deployed CCTV network, I was able to upgrade those so that I could detect a chem attack at the same time. Can I look at different technologies that are already deployed and upgrade them? Can I look at the existing infrastructure that's already deployed and leverage that? Can I look at the smoke detectors, which are required by fire code within the U.S. to be in every single building, be in every single hallway, in every single room? Can I upgrade that fire alarm so that it can detect bioagents at the same time? If people are deploying fire systems throughout buildings because it's required, and let's say they had to pay a premium of 10 or 20% for that fire system, but it would help protect them against a bioagent, they're much more likely to do that than if I tell them they have to deploy a complete new network, which would cost them 10 times as much money. Can I leverage the CCTV systems that exist across the country, especially within metro stations, within subway systems, and can I develop capabilities on that look at behavior detection, that at least give me a warning that there might be something untoward going on? Leveraging those existing infrastructures and those existing technologies seem to be the only way that we're going to have a reasonable likelihood of the integration of new technologies. And that's the challenge that we have. Another tool within the United States that I know other countries are exploring is the use of the Safety Act. This is a special legal tool that's available to the Science and Technology Directorate that actually gives liability protection for people to deploy anti-terrorism technologies. Now, this can be significant. In some ways, it necessarily isn't. But you can look after 9/11. There was some fear by companies within the U.S. where legal liability is substantial that if they deploy a counterterrorism technology or an anti-terrorism technology and it doesn't work, they could be sued for that for a substantial amount of money. The Safety Act was meant to provide them protection. If they deployed it and it was tested beforehand and for some reason it didn't work, they wouldn't be sued. Their company would be protected. So what we're trying to do is leverage that liability protection that's out there to do things such as develop what we call block designations, or basically establish a best practice for a security element that says if you achieve this best practice, that you will then get liability protection as well as providing a target for private industry to shoot for. And so what we're looking at is the challenge of how do we deploy, how do we incentivize, how do we make it cost effective for these new technologies we develop, because we know we have a thinking adversary who will be changing their tactic, techniques, and procedure on us. Now, as a technology guy, I have to apologize. This slide really doesn't show up as it should, but imagine the whole slide is shown. You can kind of see in there the picture in the background in the gray area. And we like to use this to illustrate the challenge that we face. So this is a fairly famous painting where you can see someone plowing the field. You can see boats In the background, you can see a shepherd tending a sheep. It gives the idea of a bucolic setting. This is everyday life. This is exactly where we live. We go about and we live our lives, and we are not necessarily aware of what's going on. And then what we normally see is the rest of that slide fade, and in the lower right-hand corner, you can see these little legs splashing in the ocean. And so it depicts Icarus's fall. And you can look at this in two ways. One way is to say, what technologies are being developed out there that could help us change the world, hopefully for the better? What technologies are being done that we're not even aware of, that someone working in their basement or some researcher in a university is developing that can improve our security, improve, solve cancer? And then you can look at the other way as what technologies are being done in someone's basement that we're completely unaware of that might not be used for good purposes. But there are things going on that we have no idea about. As the commissioner said, that our expectations are almost always wrong and that we need to be prepared. So how can we be adaptive? How can we emphasize and incentivize and create efficiencies to develop new technologies, both to gather those, forage for those technologies that are good, as well as defend against those that are bad? Thank you.